This is an oral history interview with Mr. Charles Finson in his home on August 24, 1983. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Finson, what was your father's name and where was he born?
My father was William L. Finson, and he was born in Fort Scott, Kansas.
And your mother?
My mother was Bertha Danford, and she was born in Grant City, Missouri.
What type of work did your father do?
My father was educated as a lawyer, but practiced only very briefly, and then owned and operated a grain elevator here in Monticello for most of his working career.
What was the name of the grain elevator?
Well, it carried his name, W.L. Finson, and the business was basically in the grain, coal, and feed business.
Where was it located?
Well, it was located on West Main Street, on what is now the site of Monticello Grain Company.
Do you have any idea what year he began the business?
Yes, he began managing the business for another firm in 1907, and then about 1917 he purchased the other interests, and it became solely his after that.
How did he happen to come to Monticello?
One of the owners of the business, which also owned some other elevators in other places, was a relative, an uncle of his, and he was instrumental in having my father come here.
Was he your first relative to come to Piatt County?
Yes.
You said he was a lawyer, so he went to law school. Do you have any idea how long your mother attended school?
Through freshman year of high school, I believe.
Which is typical of that period. When did your first ancestors settle in the United States?
Well, in the Finson family, the first one that we know about came into New England, Massachusetts and Maine, and that area, along in the early 1700s sometime.
Do you know about the other side of your family?
Not that specifically, I don't. My mother did know that she had relatives who were in the Revolutionary War. And in fact, I'm not sure that I could authenticate this, but she had indicated that General Marion, who was known as the Swamp Fox in the Revolutionary War, was a relative.
Did your mother ever work outside the home?
Yes. She was the postmistress at Stonington, Illinois, prior to her marriage to my father. Her family, as I mentioned, lived in northwest Missouri at the time she was born, but then moved to Illinois and lived in the little town of Awanico in Christian County. And Stonington is near that, and they had later moved to Stonington, and while living there, she became the postmistress.
How many children were in your family?
I'm the only one.
You were the only one?
Yeah.
Where were you born?
I was born here in Monticello.
Did you have anybody live with your family besides your parents?
No.
Any grandparents? Or?
No.
What house did you grow up in? Where was it located?
Well, it was located on West Marion Street and was immediately south of the grain elevator that my father operated, and the house has since been moved, and all of the site now is occupied by the various buildings of Monticello Grain Company.
What kind of chores did you do as a child?
Well, as I grew up, I got to work around the elevator some. Just various little tasks that I could do depending on my age and so forth.
Did you have anything special you did with your spending money?
No, not really.
Where did you go to school then?
Well, I went through grade school and high school here in the Monticello school system.
Did you go to South?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was known as South School then rather than Washington.
Right. How many were in your class in high school?
Well, in high school, when I graduated from high school, I think maybe like 57.
What year was that?
That was 1932.
What did you do after high school?
Well, I went to the University of Chicago and graduated there in 1936.
What was your major?
Business administration.
To go back just a little bit, when you were growing up, what kind of games did you play as a child with the neighborhood children?
Well, I suppose the game we played most was baseball, in one form or another, softball, hardball, but basketball quite a bit. We tended to play the sports that were in season with the high school teams. If it was football season, the kids played football. If it was basketball season, they played basketball. And those were the primary sports. I suppose when we were smaller, we played all the games that small children play, like hide and seek and so forth.
Who were some of your friends, close friends, as you were growing up?
Well, in the neighborhood where I lived, there were several boys. Our next door neighbors were the Armsworth family, and there were two sons, both older than I am, Sam Armsworth and Jim Armsworth. They were cousins of Joe Raycraft, who operated the drugstore here for a number of years, and they both became pharmacists later and had a store known as Raycraft's in Decatur. Neither of them is living at this time. Also in the neighborhood was the Charlie Doss family, and Charlie Doss operated the International Harvester Implement Shop, which was located on West Main Street, and he had a son, again slightly older than I am, but one who played around the neighborhood, and his name was Howard Doss.
When you were in high school, was there any specific trend in clothing that you recall? It seems like every generation has their own style.
Well, styles were quite a bit different than they are now, certainly. For the most part, we wore what today would kind of be considered dress-up clothes, I think. It was unusual to see a high school student in jeans. Mostly we wore wool slacks through most of the year, the type of clothing that had to be cleaned and pressed. And shirts were mostly what would now be called dress shirts. At least they were shirts with dress collars on them, and sweaters. And that was the normal dress, and a little more formal than today.
Yes. Do you have any impressions of the Depression as you were getting out of college?
Well, yes, I do. The Depression was in pretty full swing at the time I was in college. I recall that the year I was a freshman, and this would have been in the late winter and early part of 1933. The banks here in Monticello, the Moore Bank, had closed prior to the bank moratorium, which occurred on March 4th of 33. And my father's business did its banking at the Moore Bank, and so he was without a bank account, and that was a kind of a serious problem for a college freshman. And I had a small savings account in the other bank here, which at that time was the First National Bank. So I decided maybe I should come draw my savings money out and use it to finish up the term, and there was about enough to do that. So on a Friday night, I came home with the idea of going to the bank on Saturday morning and withdrawing the money. And it turned out that that Saturday morning was March 4th, 1933, when the bank moratorium started. So I didn't get my money out of the bank at that time, and that bank was closed permanently after that. So I eventually got the money back in later years when they did liquidate the assets of the bank. But that was one Depression story that I remember. People seemed to while there was a lot of hardship during the Depression, people seemed to adjust to it rather remarkably well, thinking back on it. The habits were certainly less luxurious than most of us enjoy today. People didn't spend money for really much in the way of pleasures or frills. I remember in the summertime in those years, here there was quite a softball program, and that's kind of when night softball started here in Monticello, and many people would go to these games out in Forest Preserve because it was something to do, and I think they passed a hat for a little money to pay the light bill, but it really didn't cost people much, if anything, to go there. One very popular thing was the Lyric Theater, which at some time during that period had drawings, and each week they draw out a winner for a cash prize, and compared to the lottery amounts of today, they were rather small prizes, but still this was quite popular, and then of course people could go to the movies rather inexpensively. I think maybe for 25 cents you could get into the movie. So people just kind of made do with what they could, and were, I think to a pretty good degree, rather philosophical about it and made the best of it.
Could you tell any difference in the climate between Chicago and Monticello during the Depression, since you got to see both sides?
Well, yeah, the weather in Chicago is a little different than it is in Monticello. It seemed like in the wintertime it was always awfully cold in Chicago and was very windy. And that always made it seem like it was several degrees colder than here.
I was thinking of the people's attitude, how people reacted during the Depression.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yes, I think there was an awful lot of poverty in Chicago at that time. I don't know how to generalize on it any more than that. I suppose it's a little harder for people in a city to get along under poverty conditions than perhaps out here. Here you could have gardens and these kind of things that would help. But, and of course, politically, there was a very strong response to the Depression in the election of 1932, and that was very evident in Chicago. I was up there at the time of that election, and there was a very great groundswell to change parties and change administration, and that was the election in which Roosevelt was first elected.
Were people fairly excited about Roosevelt? Did they think that he was going to make sweeping changes immediately?
Yes, I think that was the hope. Yes.
How did you get back and forth between Monticello and Chicago?
Usually on the train. That's one of the things that's changed a lot over time, really, is transportation. And I might just comment on that a little bit if I may digress. But, I always enjoyed the trains, and of course they operated with steam engines then, but the trains were good. They carried good schedules. They were inexpensive. I can remember there would usually be a weekend excursion rate that I could come home on that might be anywhere from $3 to $5 round trip. So train travel was relatively inexperienced. In that period of time, though, there has been quite a change in the way people get around. When I was young, cars were just becoming common. They were common, but hadn't been very long. In our family, I think I was 12 or 13 years old before we had a car. And prior to that time, we'd go on the trains. And of course, the interurban system was in existence then. And typically, if we went to Decatur, we'd go on the interurban. But also in that regard, grain that moved in to the elevators from the country back in the 20s and 30s primarily was delivered in wagons drawn by horses. There weren't many trucks yet at that time. And that, of course, has had quite a change with the trucks that have come in and the big ones. There were still some horses and buggies, family ones around when I was young. And as I say, a lot of the work was done with horses. And it'd be kind of hard to find any work horses around anymore, I think.
Do you recall how much it cost to ride the interurban from here to Decatur?
Oh, not exactly, but less than $1.
Uh-huh. How long did it take you to get from Monticello to Decatur?
I suppose an hour, maybe. The interurban stopped at Bemet, Saragordo, and I guess maybe at Oakley. But also, they would stop at most any crossing out in the country if someone wanted to board it or get off.
How many train cars was it usually? One or two?
On the interurban?
Mm-hmm.
Usually one, but sometimes two or three. If it happened to be a weekend when there was heavy travel, they'd add a car or two, but typically just one car.
After you got out of college, what did you do?
Well, I went to work in the grain elevator for my father.
Mm-hmm. What was your job there?
Well, primarily I worked in the office. I was the bookkeeper and the clerk and kind of the chief bottle washer in the office. And I suppose, while we didn't title it that way, I was kind of the assistant manager.
Mm-hmm. How did you happen to meet your wife?
Well, we'd gone to high school together, and Artist's family name is Hannah, and their home was in Whiteheath, and she went to grade school at Whiteheath, but came to Monticello for high school, and so we went through high school together.
Do you recall your first date?
Yes.
What was it?
Yes. Well, Artist had a sister, and another friend of mine and I went to their house, and we had double dates with the two sisters, and that was while we were still in high school.
Mm-hmm. So what year did you get married then?
We were married in 1937.
Mm-hmm. How many children do you have?
3. The oldest one is Michael, who was born in 1941. He attended college at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston and has stayed in that area since. He went through high school at a time when there was a great deal of emphasis on scientific subjects and became interested in that field and now works as an astrophysicist. Our second child is our daughter, Freya, who now lives in Leavenworth, Kansas. Freya attended Christian college at Columbia, Missouri for 2 years and then graduated from the University of Missouri and has lived in Topeka for a time and now Leavenworth for a number of years. Our younger son is Hugh. Hugh attended college at DePauw and graduated there with his bachelor's degree and then attended law school at the University of Illinois. Hugh now lives in Monticello, and at the present time is state's attorney in Piatt County.
Where did you and your wife live when you were first married?
Well, the first home we had was an apartment in what's been known for many years as the Brady House on East Washington Street. It was a two-room apartment. One was a kind of a combination living room and bedroom. We had a pull-down bed, and the other room was a kitchen. Mm-hmm. And we lived there for about a little over a year, I guess. Interestingly, looking back in these days of inflation, our rent was $25 a month.
Well, that's very good.
Yeah.
When World War I came along, or II came along, how were you affected?
Well, I wasn't in World War II. During the early part of World War II, well, in 1943, my father died, and I continued to operate the grain company. It was designated as an essential industry during the war, and I was deferred from military service to act in capacity of operating that. So I was fortunate to spend the war years at home and operated that business.
Did you have any trouble getting gasoline and other things that you needed to run your business?
Well, gasoline was rationed. Gas use during the war for personal use was rather closely rationed, but for the operation of trucks and business essential vehicles, they made an adequate amount of gas available. It was rationed, but you got more. Looking back, I'd say, compared to a normal time, running any business was pretty difficult. For one thing, the high percentage of young people that might have been utilized in a business were gone. They were in the Army, most of them. So personnel was difficult. I know we operated our business primarily with older people, and fortunately some very dedicated ones who really were willing to work hard during that time to get things done. Employees were hard to locate, and the employment market was very tight. Supplies were hard to get. You had to make do with a lot of things. It was a difficult time, but fortunately it was not so difficult with what the job could be done, and fortunately also didn't last too long.
When did you go into the banking business?
Well, I stayed in the grain business until 1953, and at that time, my mother and I were partners in the business, and we sold it to Monticello Grain Company. From late 53 through 1956, I worked for the Staley Company in Decatur, and then came into the bank in January of 1957.
What was your position when you started at the bank?
Well, I came in as the president.
And we should say on tape which bank this is.
That's National Bank of Monticello.
Right.
Thank you for the commercial.
Who were some of the people you worked with when you began at the bank?
At the time I started, William M. Welch, Bill Welch, was cashier. E.A. Archie McCraw was farm manager and trust officer. The tellers were Edna Seneff and Gene Heitz and Carl Bowdry. Olga Dubson was the bank's secretary, and we had 3 bookkeepers, and I'm not sure I can tell you who they were now.
So you had a fairly small staff.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the bank was located in the same spot it is now.
Yes. Mm-hmm. On the northeast corner of the square.
Was the National Bank always located in that spot?
Yes, it was. I mentioned earlier that the Moore State Bank had closed sometime in the midwinter of 1932-33, prior to the bank moratorium. And then at the bank moratorium, the First National Bank was closed permanently. So Monticello was without a bank after March 4th, 1933. During 1933, a number of the business people got busy on the project of forming a new bank. The leader, as I remember this, kind of getting all this started, was Dr. Bumstead, who was then mayor. At any rate, the bank was chartered, stock was subscribed, and all the necessary things were done to enable the bank to open and start its business on December 15th, 1933.
Who started as the president of the National Bank then?
Well, the first president was Willard Porterfield, and his widow, Mrs. Porterfield, still lives here in Monticello. The other primary management officer of the bank when it was formed was Herbert Moeller, who was vice president, cashier, and trust officer.
Did Mr. Porterfield continue till you took over?
No, Mr. Porterfield died in 1953. And following his death, Bela Stoddard served as president for a short time, and I'm going to say maybe a year. And then Robert Levitt was president for a period of time, but he had left the bank before I came into it. So there was a period of time in which there was not a president at the bank, and I started, as I say, in January '57.
Looking back from when you were a child, what kind of businesses have been on the square, and how has it changed?
Well, in the earlier period, it seems to me we had more businesses than we do now. They certainly tended to be smaller, but more of them. I can recall at one time we must have had at least 7 or 8 grocery stores, most of which were located on the square. In fact, it was kind of an unusual thing when the first neighborhood grocery was started. But the grocery stores were much smaller than our supermarkets now, of course. When you went to the store, a clerk waited on you, in contrast with today's self-serve system. Most of the stores had a delivery system. I can recall my mother did probably most of her grocery shopping by calling the grocery on the phone and ordering what she wanted, and they delivered it. And in fact, Ardith did that for a great many years until finally, some 15 years ago, delivery service ceased. But there were more of other businesses. There were several clothing stores. Certainly we had more barber shops than we do now. There were 2 grain elevators, where we have 1 now. At varying times, I would say we had more auto dealers than now, and the number of lines that they would sell was more limited than they are now. It would be a Ford dealer who sold nothing but Fords. Chevrolet dealer sold nothing but Chevrolets. We had quite a number of filling stations, probably twice as many as we have now. But the businesses tend to be smaller and more of them, and they were able to operate in those days apparently on a smaller scale than you can do now.
Were the streets around the business area paved when you were growing up?
Yes. The streets on the square and the other arterial streets in town were paved, mostly brick to start with, although there were some concrete streets being built in the 20s. But the square was all brick to start with. The traffic was two-way around the square, where it's been one-way now for a number of years. One of the distinctive little things that I recall about the square was at each corner there was a little kind of a moon-shaped disc installed on the street, and you were to either turn inside or outside of that little marker. There's one of those on each corner of the square. Those have long since disappeared, of course.
What type of street lights did you have as you grew up?
Well, on the square, there were, most of them opened at 7 probably in the morning and didn't close till 6 in the evening. Saturday was a big business day in Monticello in the 20s and 30s. And the stores were open Saturday night, and the grocery stores particularly, I know, were open as late as midnight on Saturday night because people come in from the farms, do their shopping, do their visiting, and usually stayed pretty late. And when it was time to go home, they pick up their groceries and go. Also, one of the traditions in Monticello for many years was band concerts. And I recall for many years band concerts were on Wednesday night. There was a bandstand that was moved from week to week to a different side of the square, so that the band would make the circle around the square with its location. It was a municipal band made up of local people, but that also was a shopping night. Stores were all open on Wednesday night until well after the band concert was over. But most people came downtown on Wednesday night to hear the band concert. There was always a crowd of people, and something which I have rather pleasant memories of. It was always fun to go to the band concert, and that's one of the institutions that no longer exists.
Did the band members have uniforms?
Yes. As I recall, navy blue uniforms with military-type caps, and these were mostly, during the 20s, were mostly adults in the band, and nearly all local people. Along in the 30s, the high school band took over the band concerts, and for many years the high school band played the concerts, and their uniforms were usually white shirts and white duck slacks or something of that sort. They were all dressed uniformly, but the uniforms weren't that formalized.
What changes have you seen in the banking business since you took over?
Banking business, during the 25 years I was in the bank, has been expanded quite a bit. I suppose the number one change really has been in the size of the banks in terms of dollars deposited, dollars of assets. Inflation, of course, has caused a lot more dollars to be created, So all banks are much larger in terms of dollar size now than they were 25 years ago. The National Bank had total assets of approximately $4.5 million in 1957, and today it's like 65 million. So growth in terms of dollars has been great. This, of course, has in itself brought more activity, brought about the need to expand the number of employees. But also, I think banks have broadened the things they do. The types of lending, for instance, that the National Bank of Monticello, at least, carried on in 1957 were somewhat limited. They didn't make a lot of what we know now as installment loans. They didn't make many real estate loans. Primarily, they made business loans and farm loans, and that was about the lending field. Today, this has been expanded until the bank, and all other banks, of course, make loans for almost any purpose that can be legitimately conceived. Other outside services have been added. Trust work has been expanded. Just a great many things that banks did not know and that our people did not require in 1957 have been expanded into today's type of activities.
What other organizations and churches have you belonged to in Monticello?
Well, my family and I have been members of the Methodist Church for a number of years. In terms of community organizations, I've been a member of the Rotary Club since 1937. For many years, our business association in Monticello was known as the Monticello Community Club, and I've been involved in it over the years, and it was replaced shortly after the end of World War II by what's now known as the Monticello Chamber of Commerce, and I have been active in earlier years with it. I've been a member of the golf club for a number of years, and I guess really most of the other organizations that have existed in town.
Talking about the Chamber of Commerce, there used to be various types of festivals or like the Harvest Day on the square. What were some of those?
This was not related to the Chamber of Commerce particularly, but for several years after World War II, Monticello had what was known as a Firecracker Festival on July 4th and the few days around the 4th. It would have a parade, was located in the Forest Preserve Park at the north side of Monticello. It always had entertainment, carnival, usually some evening dances with big-name dance bands. And this was quite a thing in our area for the several years that it existed. Later on, the Chamber, though, was active in a number of promotions, certainly some of the sale-type activities, but also the Chamber of Commerce sponsored what was known as Western Week, which was held for, maybe 6 or 8 years at least, in the early 60s. this was kind of the time when Western shows had become popular on TV and everybody was Western-minded. So there was a week in which everybody dressed Western. The stores put on old-type Western fronts, in many cases, and brought out bales of straw and hay, and people that had horses rode the horses for that week, and it was just kind of an old-time Western celebration, and very popular and very successful. And these things, both Western Week and the Firecracker Festival, I guess, were so good and grow to be so big that finally it became difficult to get it all done, and they died out.
Do you recall any of the names of the bands that came for the Firecracker Festival?
Well, yes. I recall that Duke Ellington's band was here once. Lawrence Welk several times. Freddie Martin. Ted Weems' band played in those days, and the singer for that band was Perry Como, whom people today would recognize. Mm-hmm. There were always a good number of bands available usually from the Chicago area.
Did they come down on train?
I think usually they came by bus.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe train. Yeah.
Did they have dancing?
Yeah. In the park, the dances were either held in the pavilion, which really wasn't very big if you had a big band, a well-known band. And so sometimes they would put up a large tent with a portable dance floor in it. One of the interesting things about the dances, usually at that time, was that the money was taken in by selling tickets for each dance. The orchestra would play a set of numbers that might last 5 minutes. And at the beginning of that time, you and your partner would go on the floor and give up a ticket, which you'd purchased outside. And then at the end of that set, everybody leave the floor, and it'd be a little break to clear the floor. And then the next dance would start, and you had to have another ticket to get back on. That proved to be a very popular thing for a while. But then, because that was really a lot of work and took a number of people to carry it out, later on just a flat admission fee became more popular. But that was kind of the early 10 cents a dance concept, I guess.
That's interesting. What car do you remember as the first automobile that you saw or hit or your family owned?
Well, the first car that our family owned was along about 1925 or 26 and was an Overland. And they haven't made those now for 40 years, I suppose. But it was a four-door sedan type car. Looked pretty great in those days.
Do you recall seeing airplanes as you were growing up?
Yes, and airplanes were a real novelty at that point. In the 1920s, they were mostly small, biplane type planes, usually the type that were barnstorming around. Once in a while, a plane would land in one of the pasture fields near to town and take up passengers for a period of time. But in those days, a plane was enough of a novelty that when one went over, everybody rushed out to look at it. And, another thing right in that connection, though, that was real interesting, again, in the 20s, dirigibles became popular. And there were several of those. I think maybe our military owned some, and occasionally you would see one of those. But there were also some large ones, like the transatlantic one that had the tragic accident later, that did fly around, and I can remember seeing it go over Monticello.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And of course they were large, and really that was quite a thrill to see one of those.
I imagine that would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever get the chance to ride in one?
No.
Did you get to travel much as you were growing up?
Well, measured by today's standards, not really. People weren't able to move around that much for the most part. We had relatives in Chicago and would travel there occasionally by train. In the 30s, we took some automobile trips into Missouri and Kansas and into some of those areas. But I guess the longest trip we took while I lived at home was 1 year to Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Were the roads fairly good at that point?
Well, yes. During the 1920s, there was a great deal of highway road building done in Illinois and in other states. Concrete roads were poured rather extensively at that time. They were 2-lane roads, but as compared to our 4-lane now, but they were good and they were easy to travel on. The roads were much narrower than they are today, but so were the vehicles.
When you traveled, did you stop and stay at motels or?
Well, during the time we're talking of in the late 20s and 30s, motels as such hadn't come into being. So usually you stopped at a hotel, mm-hmm. one that would be in the central business district of whatever city you were in.
Well, we should go back to your career at the National Bank just a moment. And how long did you stay at the bank?
I worked there for 25 years. Mm-hmm. I retired at the end of December of 1981.
And what have you been doing since you retired?
Well, really not very much. I've kept a few activities. I'm still on the board of the bank. For a number of years, I've been a member of the board of trustees of John and Mary E. Kirby Hospital, and I continue to serve on that board. I've been a trustee of the Monticello Cemetery for a number of years, and I continue to do that. So it's kind of nice to continue some of those activities and be a little bit of a part of what's going on in town.
Well, I thank you very much for your time.